Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. This is our last class on this series on the laws of the higher life. We have been exploring Annie Besant's writings about the subject, and today the last subject is what she called the law of sacrifice. So this is connected to what we saw last week, the law of duty, but this has a deeper meaning, a deeper effect, as we are going to see. So she says, we have seen that we can only realize ourselves as a higher consciousness in proportion as we tranquilize the senses and restrain the mind. We talked about this in the early talks when she was talking about the larger consciousness. We have then seen that we advance towards the realization of the higher life in proportion as we obey the law of duty, as we definitely and resolutely set ourselves to pay the obligations that we have incurred. So what we saw last week is that following the law of duty is a way of going along with the law of karma and paying the karmic links or connections or causes, working out these karmic actions that we have generated in the past. We not only learn, purify ourselves, but also we get rid of some karmic links that keeps us in situations where we still have to work out whatever we created in the past, and therefore we are not free to move on in other areas. So this is more or less what she's talking about here. And then she says, tonight we shall try to rise into a higher region and see how, after practicing the law of duty, the law of sacrifice lifts us upwards and enables us to reach union with the divine. So let's see what she proposes. It has often been truly said that sacrifice is printed on the universe in which we live. All religions teach that the manifestation of the universe in which we live began by an act of divine sacrifice of the Logos in order that the world may come forth. So in one way or the other, religions talk about sacrifice. She was talking to an Indian audience, and this is very prominent in Hinduism, the idea that the universe was created as an act of sacrifice. In other traditions, especially in more ancient religions, that is the case too. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, not so much. The idea of sacrifice is there. We are going to see a little of that. And of course, in Christianity in particular, the sacrifice of the Christ, being crucified for the sins of humanity, plays a central role. So that the idea of sacrifice is there, not so much in the creation of the cosmos, but in regard to this particular subject, she says the nature of that sacrifice is seen by us as consisting in the assumption of the limitations of matter by that which is immaterial, in the veiling of that which is unconditioned in conditions, and the binding of the free within bonds. Because the idea is that, for example, in the Theosophical view, the Logos is a state of consciousness that, as Besant says here, is beyond the limitations of matter, beyond the conditioning of matter. There is a freedom in consciousness that is not limited by matter, that we cannot even conceive. But then in manifesting a cosmos, the Logos, the cosmic mind, is embodying itself, the whole universe, and therefore it voluntarily gets trapped into matter. Of course, this is how we see it. That's why Annie Besant says is seen by us in this way. This is how we perceive it. And actually, there are people where, as we become more aware of our spiritual nature, even if intuitively and not in a very self-conscious way, but as we become more aware of the spiritual nature, we sometimes feel like waking up, we may feel like we are coming into something that is dense, or wearing something that is heavy. Consciousness does feel that coming into more material realms is a kind of sacrifice and limitation. So in Hinduism, as I was saying, this is explicitly said that the divine sacrifices itself in order to create all this material aspect that is important for the evolution of the souls, but it's from the divine's point of view, it is an act of limitation. Of course, all this is allegorical. We cannot say that we understand what the divine consciousness is, and as we are going to see at the end of the talk, that which seems to be a sacrifice from the lower is a form of joy from the higher, but we will see that later. So she says, manifestation of life is only possible by drawing around itself matter, which it appropriates as form. As form wastes in the exercising of the life functions, life is ever engaged in drawing in fresh matter to replace that which has been lost. We see that the form is always decaying and always being renewed. Life can evolve only by continually taking fresh matter into its decaying form, thus preserving it as a vehicle of manifestation. So we see that at the level of the material forms, well, the physical body is the most obvious aspect, but we could also say at the level of what in Theosophy we call the emotional body, the mental body too. There is this constant need to keep building up the vehicle of consciousness, let's say the body. We need to eat, we need to take care of the body, we need to exercise it. There is a lot of attention that has to be put simply on maintaining the body in a more or less healthy state. And when we are born as a baby, as pure consciousness, let's say, in a body and begin to experience the world, the first thing that we experience, perhaps I would say, is the limitations of the body, the needs of the body, the needs to be constantly paying attention to the body. The baby is asleep, is unconscious, and is brought to consciousness when the body is hurting in some way because of hunger or thirst or physical pains. So what Annie Besant is saying here, and she will make it more explicit in what follows, is that the consciousness that is expressing through a material form begins to have this sense of the need to acquire, the need to gather. So she says, thus there comes to be implanted in the very nature of the growing being the idea that by taking, by grasping, by holding, the life is preserved, the life is increased. So because this then is extended, we need to have certain material conditions so that our body can grow. So we need a home, and then for us to be happy, we need to acquire things or relationships or this or that. So, and there is, as she says, implanted in the very nature of the consciousness that is growing, this idea that I need to acquire, I need to gather. So she says, this seems to be what the life is learning by its contact with matter, and it does not realize in the earlier stages that taking, grasping, holding, keeping is not really the condition of the life, but the condition of the maintenance of that form in which life is manifested. So, of course, at this point, for most people, there is not a difference between life and form. I am alive as long as this body is alive. That's what we feel. When the body dies, then we realize that that is not the case, but then we forget when we incarnate again. So, for the most part, whatever happens to the body is happening to us as life, as consciousness. And we don't realize, as she says, that all these needs don't really belong to us as consciousness, as life. They belong to the bodies that we are using to express ourselves on the physical plane, let's say. So, everywhere is the soul learning that on the path of pravritti, she's using a Sanskrit word here that is, she translates it as the path of forth going. The idea is the path in which consciousness is getting deeper and deeper into matter. There is this idea of the U-shape evolution. So there is a path where evolution goes down into the material, and then evolution goes to an ascending arc, going back to the spiritual realms after having experienced the lower realms. So the coming down of the soul is the path of forthgoing or pravritti. So everywhere the soul learns that on this path must grasp, take hold, and appropriate. But once the evolving soul reached the necessary point of materiality, the great teachers began to give a strange teaching, contrary to all the preceding experience. So, in the first part of evolution, that is necessary and natural, as with the children. Children, as I mentioned before, it is a natural stage to be self centered, to require attention, to require care. And as long as the child is a child, a good parent then will respond to that need. But as the child grows and there is a sense of responsibility that begins to awaken, then there is the teaching changes. There is a teaching that others are also important. So something similar happens to the soul. At a certain point in evolution, religious teachers that before didn't place emphasis on this aspect now begin to talk about what is needed for the next stage in the evolution of humanity. So they say, it is a mistake to think that you can live and grow simply by the appropriation of other forms. All living things exist by virtue of mutual exchange, by the recognition of the fact of mutual interdependence. You cannot preserve your own form by the appropriating of others without contracting a debt, which must be paid by the sacrifice of some of the appropriated object for the maintenance of other lives. All lives are bound together by a golden chain, and that golden chain is the law of sacrifice, not the law of grasping. So, at the first stage, the idea of sacrifice is introduced in humanity by means of external sacrifices, as we are going to see. You see ancient religions, in one way or the other, there is always the idea of sacrificing something to the divine, offering something to the divine. There is this idea, and the divine may be something very wide, in the sense of sacrificing to the sun and the moon and the earth, and depending on what religion we are talking about. But by means of these religious injunctions, humanity begins to generate this sense that just as we are getting things, it is our duty to start to give things back, to sacrifice things. So, for example, some Neoplatonists were against animal sacrifice, and they wrote about that, against that, and saying, of course, that this was making animals suffer, etc. This something similar to what many people today think. But then there was one Neoplatonist that defended the act, not necessarily that he was saying that people should keep doing the sacrificing animals. This Neoplatonist was Iamblichus, and basically what he was saying is that it was a teaching device in which, in the act of sacrificing an animal to the divine, what people were learning, at the beginning not very consciously, but eventually in a clear way, they learn that they too have an animal part, and that they need to sacrifice that to the divine. So he was saying that was a way of teaching people these things. Perhaps at a certain point in humanity, teachings have to be quite visual. And as we grow and we are able to grasp more abstract ideas, then the more visual and practical part is not necessary any longer. So I think probably the Greeks were living in that time, the ancient Greeks, in the transition between the ability to perceive more abstract ideas. But in any case, the idea of sacrifice in any kind, of course, there are always in humanity, any teaching is also misapplied, and there are always applications that are wrong. But in general, the idea of sacrifice in religions had this particular teaching in mind. So, for example, Annie Besant says the universe that emanated by an act of supreme sacrifice can only be preserved by the continual renewal of sacrifice. Life is preserved by sacrifice, and in sacrifice all evolution is rooted. In order that this new lesson might be taught in the correct way, we find the great teachers insisting on acts of sacrifice and showing that by virtue of these acts the wheel of life revolves, that brings to us all good things. Thus, for example, we see established in the Hindu ritual the well-known 5 sacrifices. So she gives the example of the 5 sacrifices to the devas, to the ancestors, etc., etc. In the Old Testament, there are also 5 sacrifices in Leviticus, I think it is. Sacrifice, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering. There are 5 of them. And then, of course, we see in native traditions, sacrifices to different gods or forces of nature, so that there can be a good, harvest, etc. Of course, this is a rather, taken in this literal way, is a rather crude idea of sacrifice, but it is the way to start teaching the infant humanity this idea of, you have to give something back in response to taking what life is giving you. And of course, that can degenerate in a transactional sense of the deity, which happened, so that you are basically buying favors from the deity. But all in all, at that point of evolution, it begins to establish or imprint this idea of sacrifice in the mind of humanity. Now, this, of course, is not enough for a deeper spiritual life. Annie Besant says, such the old lesson given to young humanity, to teach it in the form and essence of the sacrificial act. Then the next step is placed before the evolving soul. You have learned to do some acts as acts of obligation. You know, this idea of the sacrifices, they were some kind of obligation. If you want this, then you must do that. So this is the transactional nature that I was talking about. But now, you now have to learn that the world is bound by action, that is by karma, except that action which is sacrifice. So basically, all actions bind you to the world. They may bring happiness, they may bring suffering, but all actions will bring you as a soul, will bring you back into limitation, except those actions that are performed as a sacrifice. And this is something that in Hinduism, for example, the knowledge that action was binding us to limitations led some people to think that the way to get free from the limitations is just by abandoning all kind of actions, retiring from the world and being isolated. And then in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, Krishna teaches that even the action of not doing is an action in itself, which produces results. And then he teaches what Annie Besant is going to elaborate on here, that the only action or the only way not to generate some kind of obligation to come back into the world is by performing actions that are with absolute detachment, let's say. So let's see how Annie Besant explains it. Then it says, is the real lesson of sacrifice that of the mutability or illusion of form? Yes, that is also part of it. Actually, in the Gita that I just quoted, there is like even an extreme case of that teaching. The idea that, well, the two main characters in the Gita is Krishna, the deity, and then Arjuna, that is a soldier, and he had a duty, just like the law of duty that we saw yesterday, no, the last week. And the duty was as a soldier to fight the war that was about to start. And he said, I can't follow my duty. The other army, these are all people that were my friends, teachers, you know, etc. And then Krishna says that he has to perform that as a sacrifice. So that is where the next step comes. Not only as a duty, do it as a sacrifice. And then part of what Krishna argued is that you cannot really kill anything that is real. Anything that can be killed is unreal. You can only affect the forms, not the real self. Of course, this again can be misinterpreted, misused, etc. But I think that this idea that the only thing that can be sacrificed is that which is temporary, impermanent, and therefore ultimately speaking an illusion, that idea is part of the teaching. So coming back to what Krishna tells Arjuna is just do what you must do and don't get, you know, stuck in the results of your actions. Don't do this so that a certain action may have a certain result that is what you expect. Do things because they must be done, and that's all you do. You do them because they must be done. So this is what Besant says, you must learn that looking for the fruit of actions binds us to the world of actions, and that if we would be free from such binding, we must learn to sacrifice the fruit of action. That is the next step. So now we will look at this in more detail. But basically, we have the law of duty, that is doing things because we must. Then the early stages of the law of sacrifice is among these duties is for you to give back to the universe, to the deity, to your ancestors. You need to give back part of what is given to you. And then the next step is to learn to give up our own attachment to the fruit of the action. That is, to learn to do the action because it is right to do it and not because of what it may promise to bring. So that is a deeper step in this path. So she says, this does not mean that some particular actions are to be separated from a person's scope of activity as sacrifices, just as we saw there were certain religious sacrifices that you did specifically as a sacrifice, and then in your daily life you could be selfish or whatever. She says this step does not mean that you can separate sacrifice from your life in specific actions, but that all actions are to be seen in the light of sacrifice by the renunciation of the fruit of action. When we sacrifice the fruit of action, we are beginning to loosen the bonds which bind us to the world. That is the lesson which begins to be breathed into our ears as we approach the end of the Pravriti Marga and this path of going deeper into matter. So as a soul begins to be close to the point where we revert the direction, this pivotal point where we start going up, when we get close to that, the teaching that applies to those souls is this of beginning to learn to do the right action just because it is right, not because I'm generating good karma that will bring me happiness in the future, not because then love is going to love me, not because I will gain heaven. All those things are teachings that are fine and are good, are necessary at certain stages of the soul, but ultimately speaking, they are based on, as I said, they can be seen philosophically speaking as a transactional goodness. So as we get to the point of changing the direction in which our soul moves, we need to learn to do actions as a true sacrifice, just because they are necessary, not because they promise to bring us something. So the idea of service, as it is pointed out here, is obviously part of this, but again, it depends on how we take service. If we take service as a tool for us to evolve spiritually, or if we take service as a way of generating good karma, or even we take service as a way of feeling good about ourselves. Again, the service we do is good for the people that we serve. It is still part of our process of growth, but it's not true sacrifice as long as we are still seeking something from it. And of course, what happens is that we have mixed motivations normally. There is, to some extent, a certain personal search in what we do, but there is also a recognition that this is necessary to be done and that the action is good in itself. And so this teaching, what the teaching is proposing, is to start putting more weight on realizing how this is good to be done, regardless of how that may end up, if it brings something that I would like or not. So Besant says, all actions, as I said, are to be seen in the light of sacrifice by the renunciation of the fruit of action. When we sacrifice the fruit of action, we are beginning to loosen the bonds that bind us to the world, and this is what we learn as we approach the end of the Pravriti Marga. And then when a person has learned to perform all his actions as duty, without looking for their fruit, Then comes the critical time in the history of the evolution of the human soul, the time for turning homeward, for entering the path of return, the Nivriti Marga. So Nivriti is also a Sanskrit word which is the opposite path to the Pravriti. So when what she is saying is that there is a special point, an important point in the evolution of the soul, and that point is when the soul realizes that good actions must be done because they are good, and that's it. And of course, she's not referring to one single moment in one incarnation where the soul realizes this. That moment in which the soul realizes this may be 3 or 4 incarnations. I don't know, I'm just saying. It's something that happens gradually, but when seeing the overall evolution of the soul, you could say these incarnations were where the soul uh, shifted and began to start going home or coming home to realize its true nature. So she says the critical point comes now in the history of the evolving soul. The soul is trying to sacrifice, or the person is trying to sacrifice the fruit of action, trying to be dead to attachments. And what is the inevitable result? The attachment to the fruit falls away. This passion overcomes the person, and the person finds himself hanging, as it were, in the void. All motive for action has disappeared. He has lost the stimulus of the Pravriti Marga, and he has not yet found the stimulus of the Nivriti Marga. And this is something that perhaps many of us have experienced at some point or will experience, because many times we go through life and we do things motivated by desire or ambition or greed or fear. And as long as all these things are active, then we are active. Some people that make changes in the world, they make changes because they are powerfully motivated, and that motivation may not necessarily be very high. It may be, as I was saying, desire or fear or intolerance, even if the action is good. But what happens when the soul begins to lose all that, when desires are not strong, where fears are not strong, where ambition is not strong? Then comes this intermediate period. It's like if we throw, a ball up, the speed of the ball begins to diminish until there is a moment in which the ball is not moving, is in suspension, before slowly it begins to go down and then it accelerates. So something similar happens to the soul. There is a period where the soul is not motivated by the previous stimuli, but is not yet able to grasp the spiritual stimuli, let's say, that would motivate the action. And then this is experienced as being in the void, as being without motivation, as not knowing what to do. Life seems boring, or life may seem irrelevant, and we don't feel motivated by the regular things that the world offers. So what is our fate? Should we just give up and do nothing? So Besant explains here that the person seems to have wearied of the law of duty, in the sense that, and this happens many times, a person may have certain duties at work, with the family, etc., but having lost that motivation, this law of duty seems to be something heavy, distasteful, because there is nothing that is really stimulating us to do that. So he seems to have wearied of the law of duty, and he has not yet seen the heart of the law of sacrifice. He seems to have lost touch with the world of forms and objects, but he has not yet found touch with the world of life, with the other side. So we are letting go of the world of matter, or the motivations that come from the material aspect of the world, but we are not yet in touch with the spiritual part. And Besant says, "Fear not, O trembling soul, when that moment of utmost isolation cometh." Sometimes this is experienced as the night of, the dark night of the soul, in the general parlance, and this is something that is quite scary when it is going on. But Besant says, "Fear not to lose touch with the transitory, because there is sometimes the tendency to try to revert to the life that was before. And in most cases, that is not really possible any longer. It's like a teenager trying to go back to enjoying playing with dolls. So sometimes there is that tendency, but it's not going to be satisfied. So don't be afraid of losing touch with the transitory, ere thou findest touch with the eternal. Listen to those who have felt the same isolation, but have passed beyond, who have found the seeming void to be a veritable fullness. Hear them proclaiming the law of life, upon which thou hast now to enter. He that loveth his life shall lose it, but he that loseth his life shall find it unto life eternal. So you see, she's referring to the gospel, where basically Jesus, and in other traditions you have similar ideas, you have to let go of this life before the other life is a reality. You have to let go of the material life before the spiritual life is a reality. By that, we don't mean physically. It's not that the person has, Jesus said, you cannot go into the kingdom of heaven if you don't die first here. It's not that we should, kill ourselves. It's not that we should retire from the world. This is more an inner process. We have to let go of seeking the purpose of life in material aspects, and be open for something else to dawn, for something higher to come. But as long as we cling to the lower, as Annie Besant is going to explain, we cannot be open. We have our hands are clenched. We cannot have them open to receive the higher. So this, she says, is the test of the inner life. This is a very important point in the journey of the soul. And this is why she spends quite a bit of time in this. As I said, in one way or the other, many of us may have gone through this. In some, it depends on, on the particular journey of each soul, but in some cases, this stage is quite dramatic, and you can say, this happened at this particular time in my life. In some other occasions, it's more of an undergoing, a background feeling. The path at the level of details is different for everybody, but we all go through the general stages. So this is the test of the inner life, she says. We cannot touch the higher until we have lost grasp of the lower. But there is fear. The air seems empty. There is naught to grasp. If we lose our grasp of the lower, will we not fall into the yawning gulf below? And then comes the supreme act of faith. We stretch up our empty hands into the empty air above, and lo, the strength of the higher uplifts us. Such is the law of the higher life. In giving up the lower, the higher is secured. And by throwing up the life we know, the life eternal gains us as its own. So again, this is allegorical language, mythological language. In general, this doesn't happen in one critical instant in our lives where we let go of the lower and then something, the higher comes to us. Again, this may happen in a more dramatic way in some people, but in general, this is a poetical way of explaining this process that is more gradual than that, and that we start growing demotivated, unmotivated by what the world offers. And Besant is saying, go along with the process. Don't be afraid. Don't become cynical. Don't become, depressed. Go along with the process, knowing that this is an important time and that something else will come. If you let go, something higher will come. Just keep going. So then she says, none but those who have felt it may know the horror of that great emptiness, where the world of form has vanished, but where the life of the spirit is not yet felt. But there is no other way between the life in form and the life in spirit. And strange as it may seem, it is the moment of uttermost isolation, when the person is thrown back into himself, that from out of the nothingness of being, the eternal being arises. And he who dared to spring from the foothold of the temporal finds himself on the sure rock of the eternal. Such the experience of all those who in the past have reached the spiritual life. Such the record they have left us for our encouragement and cheering when to us too this gulf presents itself for crossing. So a comment here, the allegory of planting and waiting for the appearance of the plant. Yes, that can also be an allegory. There are also in myths the allegory of knocking at the door of the temple and the door not being open until several days later, and the person is just waiting for the door to be open, probably in difficult weather where even that person feels his or her life is threatened. But then there is this confidence that the door will be open. Or same with this idea of planting and being confident that the plant will appear. We just have to go along with the process and do whatever is necessary there. Sometimes this is called the dark night of the soul. Saint John of the Cross really talked about two nights: the dark night of the senses, and then the dark night of the soul. And the dark night of the senses is a little more like when we start being disappointed by what the world may bring. So from a certain point of view, I think this could apply to the night of the senses. But then there is also a deeper night. Once the person has gone through the night of the senses, once the person is not seeking for sensorial stimulation to be happy, to be motivated, there is also a dark night of the soul that is deeper, and that takes us from the individual to the divine. But this, again, all these things are trying to present in a certain allegorical language processes that happen within us. So then, once a person goes through that, Besant talks about when the disciple approaches his teacher, everything that belongs to the life of form, to the personal lower self, must be thrown into the fire of sacrifice. So she's talking here about quite an advanced stage of evolution in the Theosophical view. The life of discipleship happens towards the end of the evolution of the soul, where it's basically the finishing up of all these processes. So some of the things that she says here may seem too difficult, too extreme for us, but what she's talking about is where this process is going, and then she will go back to earlier stages that perhaps are closer to where some of us are. So she says, when the disciple approaches his teacher, everything that belongs to the life of form, to the personal lower self, must be thrown in the fire of sacrifice. Everything. Give then the life and surrender it utterly. Keep not back alive anything, so far as you know it, and shrink not from the consuming fire. In the blankness of isolation, trust the law which cannot fail. And the idea is that this process, as the soul matures, deepen, as I was saying, with the two nights, the night of the senses and the one of the soul. And there is a deeper and deeper process of purification, like this fire that is consuming the personal. And we have talked about the path of discipleship in the past, but the karma of the person organizes itself to help that person to get rid of the personal, and in whatever aspects of life that person is clinging to. If that person is earnest, then situations appear so that that person can work on that. And at this more advanced stage, Annie Besant says, surrender completely, let things go. Again, more as an inner experience. It's not so much, well, sometimes karma brings us to let go of things also physically, on the physical plane. But for the most part, these are inner processes. Externally, our life may not change at all. People who are, seeing us from outside, that don't know our inner journey, may not notice anything. And yet, inside there may be a revolution going on, a completely letting go of expectations, material expectations, material or psychological expectations or attachments or needs, etc. So that's part of the direction in which the process goes. And then she says the law of sacrifice is that the life of the spirit consists in giving and not in taking. So now she talks about what is on the other side. The spirit grows in pouring itself out and not in grasping, in self-surrender and not in self-appropriation, in utterly giving all that one has, sure that the fullness of the divine life will enter in. Because life is inexhaustible, ever bubbling up out of the illimitable fullness of the self. Form is limited, life is unlimited. Therefore, the form lives by taking, and the life grows by giving. Just in proportion as we empty ourselves of all that we have, is the room for the divine fullness to flow in. So you see, for example, things that on the physical plane or the lower planes, let's say, because they are material and they are limited, the relationship we have to them is one of acquiring them or losing them. So if I want to enjoy a lot of something, whatever that is, clothing, food, relationships, what I'm doing is grabbing all that for myself. And in doing so, if I have it myself, then you cannot have that. There is that intrinsic limitation in the physical. But then on the spiritual, it is completely the opposite. On the spiritual realm, the more wisdom we have, or the more peace we have, or the more compassion we have, it's not that we are taking the peace or the compassion from others. so that we have more peace and more compassion. On the contrary, the more we have of anything that is spiritual, the more that is emanated, is multiplied. I think that these stories about Jesus multiplying things, uh, they may have been true at the physical level, but interpreting this as a spiritual allegory is that the spiritual nature is constantly multiplying things. Now, what is it that the spiritual nature multiplies? Not material natures. And here is where I think modern spirituality makes a mistake, because modern spirituality tends still to be quite materialistic. So it's not that the life of the spirit will multiply the money that you have, the cars that you have, the relationships that you have. What the spirit multiplies are things of the spirit. And when Besant talks about emptying ourselves so that the divine fullness can flow in, is emptying ourselves of the material so that the spiritual come in, not so that more material comes in. That is still the mentality, the transactional mentality. Okay, I will donate this money to my church, my organization, so that God gives me more money. In the, from a spiritual point of view, is the getting is from on a spiritual sphere or aspect, and the giving up is on the material aspect. Again, that doesn't mean we need to be poor to be spiritual. Don't take this in that simplistic way. This all is more of an inner attitude, and then the external circumstances are determined by the karma created in the past, maybe many incarnations in the past. So, is the personality aware of all this? Well, normally the personality is aware of the death part of, the losing the attraction to things that were attractive before. So, from the personality's point of view, this is seen as sacrifice in the sense of pain. This is seen as losing. This is seen as dying. What Annie Besant is saying is, and she will talk about that more explicitly, from the spiritual point of view, all this that happens is a joy, is a fulfillment, is a a sense that if we could put it that way, is a blissful sense. But the question is, on what level our sense of awareness is? Are we identified with the experience as a personality, which is in losing, or are we identified in the experience as a spiritual entity? We can bring it to we always experience this in one way or the other in our regular life. But suppose there is a person that you don't care about, but you are forced by the circumstances, you are expected to give something to that person for whatever reason, whatever, as I said, transactional reason. So whatever you buy to that person or give to that person may be seen as a sacrifice, that you are not really happy doing it. You feel, I don't want really to spend money on this, but I have to do it because I want this in return. But now think of giving something to somebody you love. So there is a deep joy in giving to somebody that you love, because in that instance, you are more connected to the spiritual nature that is love, and you don't feel the sacrifice in spending that money or time or attention, whatever it is. You don't feel the sacrifice which at the material level exists, that you are depriving yourself, let's say, to make it concrete, of money so that you can give this to the other person. You are not even aware of that aspect of the situation, because you are living at the level of love and giving. But in the previous example, you are not aware of the aspect of, sharing and love, and you are painfully aware of the material aspect of the money you are spending. So something similar happens as the soul changes, or let's say, as the soul becomes aware of its spiritual nature, then what happens at the personal level begins to be less and less relevant until it becomes completely irrelevant. Like when you spend money to give something to somebody you love, that expenditure of money is completely irrelevant, even though it is happening. So that's more or less the idea of how sacrifice is experienced, and Annie Besant will mention this. It's experienced in different ways depending on whether we are stuck in the lower or in the higher. So then another question, uh, do you trade material for happiness or for love? So yes, again, if we are giving up the material because we are expecting the spiritual to come, and then we put on the spiritual all these very nice and enticing words that I'm using, love and happiness, etc., then we are not really giving anything up. We are again in the transactional aspect, which belongs to the lower nature. Okay, I'm going to give up my interest for the material because I want the spiritual. So that's not a real sacrifice. I mean, at least not sacrifice in this deeper sense that Besant is talking about. That is the beginning of sacrifice in a sense. We begin, we start giving up the material because we want the spiritual, and in doing so, it is a first step. At least we start recognizing that the spiritual is more valuable, but we are still within the realm of, not true sacrifice, but really buying the spiritual by giving up the material. Now, the deeper aspect of the law of sacrifice is when we do something just because it is the right thing to do, without expecting a result, as we were saying. The result will be there, but we are not doing it for that reason. We recognize this is something I must do, and we do it, and then the result is always there in one way or the other. It may not be in a way that, sitting now here, we would think that it is, but that is irrelevant if we are not really doing the action for the result. So any true sacrificial action, let's say, will bring a spiritual result, and in an expected way. But as I say, it's not that the person is expecting a result in any way. So then Annie Besant goes on and says, therefore, the note of the Nivritti Marga is renunciation. Renunciation is the secret of life, as appropriation is the secret of form. So here again, the contrast that she's bringing. At the material level, we gather, we appropriate. The secret of the spiritual life, or the life aspect of ourselves as opposed to the form aspect, is renunciation, is the giving, the offering. This then is the law of sacrifice that we must learn, to give ungrudgingly and ever again to give. By this and this alone we live. So remember, we said that we were in the turning point where we are entering in the Nivritti Marga, the path of return to our true nature, the path of realizing what we really are, who we really are. So this happens again, as I was saying, gradually. As we begin to recognize all this, that marks that we are entering into this path. And then the deeper we go into the path, then the more spontaneous and joyous all this becomes. But on first entering the Nivritti Marga, where renunciation offers herself as our guide, her voice may seem cold and stern. Her aspect may seem almost menacing. Let us try to understand why sacrifice at first sight gives us the idea of pain. From the standpoint of form, sacrifice is the throwing away of things. the form cries out in its anguish, in its terror, towards the withdrawing of life that maintains its very existence. And so we come to think of sacrifice as an act of pain. And this must be as long as we identify ourselves with the form. We already discussed this. As long as we are identified with the material aspect, then sacrifice is experienced in this way. But when we begin to live the life of spirit, as we begin to be more aware of our spiritual nature, even if, as I always say, being aware of the spiritual nature is not seeing our soul as a ball, spiritual ball there. This would be a sensorial experience. Begin to live the life of spirit, to be aware of the life of or our spiritual nature, is simply to feel more inclined to act in these ways as opposed to acting for what the material aspect of us want, which again, there is a natural, let's say, line of action that we need to take to preserve this form. But if we are not identified, or as we lose our identification with the form, our action for material purposes will be adequate to sustain the form, but that kind of action will not be the aim of our lives any longer. So it's not that we stop paying attention to the form and then our bodies will die. It's more of a question of we realize we need to take care of this, so that because the form is limited, it's always, as Annie Besant is saying, it always needs to be maintained, but then we live for a different reason. So we pay as much attention as we need and not more than that. In these talks, Annie Besant and we are talking to the egos of people, to the personal self. So in some way, the language is, don't worry, don't be afraid. All this is good. Ultimately speaking, this is good. Now, it's not good really for the ego. So we are telling this to the ego, but actually the message is for the real that is behind the ego. So many times this kind of speaking seems to be appealing to the ego, but the real aim is so that the spiritual nature behind listens, so that the ego relaxes. Okay, this is not so scary, and in relaxing itself, then the spiritual nature can be touched. But then the danger is that it's very easy to turn all this into an ego-based search. Again, I'm going to sacrifice because it is an honor for me, or because I'm going to get spiritual things. But from another point of view, we can say, sure, yes, that life brings us the situations in which we can give. Is also a recognition that we as a soul, to some extent, are, ready or willing to work in this way. So Besant is saying then that from the point of view of the personality, sacrifice is pain. But when we begin to live the life of the spirit, the life which recognizes the one in the manifold forms, then there begins to dawn upon us the supreme spiritual truth that sacrifice is not pain but joy, is not sorrow but delight. That which to the flesh is painful is bliss to the spirit, which is our true life. Remember the example that I gave about giving to somebody we love. We experience that as a joyful event. Then we see that the aspect of sacrifice that was sorrowful was an utter delusion, that more blissful than any bliss that the world can offer is the bliss of the free spirit, which, by pouring itself out, finds the union with the self, and knows that it is living in many forms, flowing along many channels, instead of following the limitation of a single form. So again, Besant here is describing what to her is a fact, the life of giving. When we are identified with the self, is a far happier and blissful life than the life within the limitation of the form, always with the anxiety of losing, of letting go, of dying. So Besant is saying, we cling to this that is basically a painful life with moments of happiness or joy or pleasure, but that they cannot be compared to the life when we are identified with the spiritual nature in us. And again, we can take this, or the ego can take this, as a different form of searching for a kind of egoic, pleasure. But we should understand this in the right way. This is just a description of what happens when we stopped searching from the point of view of the ego. And here is the paradox. Um, if you want to gain the eternal life, you have to lose the personal life. So if you want to gain this bliss, you have to stop searching for this bliss, to put it in the context that we are talking about. Here is the joy of the saviors of mankind, of those who have risen to the knowledge of unity and have become the guides, the helpers, the redeemers of humanity. They have found with a sense of joy inexpressible that the living self can pour itself out into all the innumerable forms and know no difference between form and form, but all are the channels of one spirit. Remember, in our first classes, we talked about that there is only one self, and therefore spirituality is the realization of the self behind every form. And this is what she's talking about here. As we recognize, as a first intellectually, and then little by little, as a deeper and deeper experience, as we recognize this unity, then this sense of joy inexpressible begin to be part of life, simply because the no joy, the negation of joy, is produced merely by our clinging to what we are not, our clinging to the limited, to the material. So when we stop clinging to this, then that which is our true nature, this inexpressible joy, and we can describe it in many other ways, or wisdom, or compassion, or love, etc. Now all that can manifest simply because we stopped clinging to something we were not. So she says, all are alike to them, the righteous and the sinful. They feel no attraction to the one, nor any repulsion from the other, because they can see that in every stage the one self is living that life which is themselves. So just as we lose sight of the physical aspect in buying a present for somebody we love, at this stage the soul loses also that concern about how the self is dressed up, whether in a pleasant form or in an unpleasant form. The soul perceives the one self behind every form, and the form is something that becomes more and more irrelevant. They can see that in every stage, as I said, the one self is living that life which is themselves. They know themselves in the stone, in the plant, in the animal, in the savage, as in the saint and the sage. And then she goes on, there is nothing but one self, and nothing outside it, either to fear or to challenge. Fear always comes from our identification with a fragment, because one fragment can be hurt, overpowered, destroyed by another fragment. If we are this, then we are in opposition to that, to what is not this. And there is this sense of fear is always associated to the attachment to the form. The form, whether it's physical or psychological, the form that always needs to be maintained. We are always also building up our ego, not only our physical body. We have to feed the ego, to try to gratify the ego, try to tell the ego how good it is. Because if we leave it alone, just as it happens with the body, if we stop feeding the ego will crumble. If we stop feeding the body will die. Because neither of them are real, real in the sense of permanent, eternal. So when we are not attached to this ego any longer, then there is no fear, there is no sense of challenge, because we are everybody, we are everything. So that is the true peace, and that alone is wisdom. To know the self is alone the spiritual life, and that life is joy and peace. This is how she started all this. That remember that she defined the spiritual life is not having powers, it's not having more virtues, it's not on the personal level, acquiring or developing, although things may happen, but they are of a secondary, a side effect in a sense. The spiritual life is the recognition of the oneself. That alone, as she says, is the spiritual life. Thus, the law of sacrifice, which is the law of life, is also the law of joy. And we know that nothing has a keener pleasure than the pleasure of pouring out and not taking in, and that no limited joy can be equal to the joy of self-surrender. When we are in love, part of that joyful or blissful aspect is that sense of surrender. There is a difference between desiring somebody and loving somebody. In desiring somebody, we are still within ourselves. In loving somebody, there is this sense of freedom, because at least for the time being, there is this surrender, there is this letting go of the ego, and then consciousness experiences a little of its true nature, which is the same as the true nature in the beloved. So again, this may seem to be trying to stimulate, or we should not take this as a stimulation to the ego, but more as an encouragement and saying, let go. At the beginning, letting go, as she said at the beginning of this talk, letting go, surrendering may feel painful, may be scary, may be, we may mistrust or distrust this line of action. But if we are willing to face the void and to jump into the void, to let go of our clinging to the lower, then the higher will take its place, and we will realize that the life of the higher is, far better than the life of the lower, to put it in rather crass way. So she says, were it possible for each of us to catch for a moment a faint glimpse of the spiritual life, then the transitory world would assume its true proportions, and we should see the worthlessness of all that people account as precious. So all these mundane, goals or rewards are seen as worthless when we see that which is of true value. And again, that doesn't mean we are not going to relate to people, but we don't relate to people based on desire. We relate to people based on the real, that is love. So it doesn't mean that we don't work, we don't have a job. But again, we don't relate to the job as with ambition, with a sense of feeding our ego. We relate to our job as with a sense of service, etc., etc. The life on the material plane must go on, but it's really coming from the spiritual as opposed from the material goals. So the last part of her talk says, let us now bring this lofty idea down to the level of our daily lives and see how the law of sacrifice will manifest in the outer world. We have learned to realize, if but for a moment, the unity of the self. How then shall we behave? We see a person low, degraded, ignorant, and foul. No special tie of kindred nor past karma binds us to that person, nor does anything that we regard as obligation join our form to his. No special tie binds us to him. So, she was talking about the law of duty, and we are bound to some people. And in the previous talk, it was, if life brings somebody and you have some kind of relationship, face it as, a spiritual duty, and try to relate, spiritually to that person. But now we are taking a deeper step. And what about all these people out there to whom, for the most part, we are indifferent because there are no ties that we have with them? She says, by the law of sacrifice, having realized the unity of the self, when we see that outcast, and of course she's mentioning not those people that we are attracted to, but she's mentioning those people or instances, situations that we are normally repelled when we are living in the lower nature. So having realized the unity of self, now coming from the spiritual nature, when we see that outcast member of the human family, we see the self in him, and the form vanishes. And we know that we are that person, and that person is ourself. Hence, compassion takes the place of repulsion. Love takes the place of hatred, and tenderness replaces indifference. So this manifests, again, little by little. We may be more inclined to help people who need it, people who, for others, that person may be annoying, or maybe a nuisance, or maybe, take too much time. But there is something within us that begins to recognize, even if unconsciously, intuitively, begins to recognize this is the self expressing through this person. And we are drawn to address that self and to do the little we can do in whatever sphere of life we move, whether it is listening to a person that most people think is annoying, or whether it is helping a person that is dirty or sick, or in whatever realm of life, life or the situations bring us. Little by little comes this recognition that goes beyond how pleasant or unpleasant the external form may be. So as the comment here, what is essential is invisible to the eye. So when we are at the level of the eye, we only see the unpleasant form when it is unpleasant, or the pleasant form. But as we come to the world of essences, then we see something that is invisible to the fleshy eye. So Besant says, those who live by the law of sacrifice realize the unity of the self and recognize differences are only in the containing vessel and not in the indwelling life. Hence, they only gather for the sake of sharing it with others and for others, and they lose utterly the sense of a separate life and become part of the life of the world. Blavatsky used to say that, for example, a disciple becomes an impersonal force in nature for goodness. And I think she's referring to this. Less and less we focus on what our personality wants. Again, within, Blavatsky also says that. She talks about self-sacrifice, but she talks about self-sacrifice with wisdom. And she says the body has to be taken care of. If we have an extreme self-sacrifice and we stop feeding our body to feed the millions of people out there, then our body will die and all the service we could do is over because we don't have a body on the physical plane. So again, when we are talking about this, we are not talking about extreme measures, but basically the body becomes one more impersonal object there. And we can take care of the body, we can take care of the mind or the emotional nature as we do to that of other people. And I think this is part of what Annie Besant is mentioning here. And the person becomes part of the life of the world, not simply an individual life. As they realize this and know that the only value of the separate form is to be a channel of the higher, they slowly and gradually rise above all thought, save the thought of unity, and feel themselves as part of this great suffering world. Only in this way can we live in the eternal. Those who see difference are continually dying, for they are living in the form, which is decaying every moment, and not in the spirit, which is life. So a way of thinking of living in the eternal is identifying ourselves with that which is eternal. When we are of the body, what happens to us is what happens to the body. So then we grow old, then we get sick, then we die. But the more we identify with that which is beyond the body, although things still happen, but they happen to the body, not to us. And we as consciousness are not so affected by what happens to the body. What happens to the body, we have to deal with it. It may take part of our attention, our energy. It may bring pleasant or unpleasant feelings, but it is not us. It's our vehicle of expression in a sense. So then, in proportion as you and I dismiss the difference between each and feel the unity of life, and know that none has a right to boast of his share of it, nor to be proud that his share is different from the share of another, only thus shall we live in the spiritual life. So she's been mentioning this idea of gathering to give, of not paying attention to what I have as opposed to what other people have, whether what I have is money, a title, fame, wisdom, virtue, ability. This fragment may have certain things and may lack other things because all fragments are limited. But we stop relating to those things as being myself and be proud of my things. These are things that are put into our hands to share them, to work for the whole. And therefore, they don't produce any sense of pride or egotism in that sense. That is the last word, it seems, of the wisdom that the sages have taught us. Nothing less than this is spiritual. Nothing less than this is wisdom. This wonderful recognition of the self beyond all selves, how shall we make it our own? Only by daily acts of renunciation in the little things of life. Only by learning in every thought, word, and action to live and love the unity. By putting ourselves last and others first. By always seeing the need of others and trying to supply it. By learning to be indifferent to the claim of our own lower nature and refusing to listen to it, and again, within the healthy boundaries. I know of no road save this humble, patient, perseverant endeavor, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, until at last the mountain tops are climbed. So you see, the problem with this is that all this to the ego sounds like the heroic journey and like this glorious thing. And it is from the point of view of evolution of the spirit. This is a glorious awakening of a divinity that is expressing through the body. But at the level of the daily life, it is something that is far simpler, or that doesn't seem exciting. It is this, as she says, the daily acts of renunciation in the little things of life. Is this constant, and by constant I mean a constant attitude of, helping, giving, being aware of what is the greater good, the general needs, etc. And all that doesn't feel to the ego glorious, heroic. On the contrary, this is why this is different, because for the ego, this feels as giving up, as dying. So she says, we dream of great deeds of heroism. We dream of mighty ordeals. We think that the life of discipleship consists in tremendous trials for which the disciple prepares himself, towards which he marches with open vision, and then, by one supreme effort, by one brave struggle, gains his crown of victory. It is not so. It is not a single deed that strikes the world with wonder which makes true discipleship. Else the hero or the martyr would be greater than the disciple. Both Blavatsky and Besant many times talked about this. It's far easier to be a hero or a martyr, where in the heat of the moment there is a supreme act of self-sacrifice, and that is far easier than the regular self-sacrifice in petty little things, in a person treating you ill and you don't return the ill treatment, all that where there is no special stimulation that calls to the ego, to be heroic. So Besant and Blavatsky used to say, the real difficult job of Jesus was not dying on the cross. Blavatsky was kind of irreverent in this, but she said, for any disciple, dying on the cross is quite a cheap price to pay. You suffer for a few hours and then you are done. You are, enlightened. Or she says, I hope it was that easy. It is far more difficult because it's not dramatic. It is in the little things of life that happens. So Besant says the life of the disciple is lived in the home, is lived in the town, is lived in the office and in the marketplace. And the last slide, the life of the disciple is one of a long series of petty renunciations, of daily sacrifices, one continual dying in time, in order that the higher may eternally live. The true life of sacrifice is that which utterly forgets itself, in which renunciation becomes so common that there is no effort, that it becomes a thing of course. If we lead that life of sacrifice, if we lead that life of renunciation, if daily, perseveringly, we pour out ourselves for others, we shall find ourselves one day on the summit of the mountain. So, you see, the idea with this is we start with little things. At the beginning, it may be a conscious effort. Eventually, this becomes part of our lives. We are not even aware that we are sacrificing anything. And then the joy of the spiritual life begins to pervade our personality. Annie Besant is always inspiring in how she presents things, and I hope this series has been not only inspiring but also give us some practical hints as to how to lead the spiritual life, and encouragement to go on this path that we have chosen, or that was chosen for us, however we experience it.